Darius Coleman sat in first class, a successful CEO, accustomed to luxury. He had pre-ordered his meal, lobster bisque and filet mignon, the same thing he always chose. But when the flight attendant returned with an apologetic expression and told him they were out of his selection, something shifted in him. What should have been a routine flight became the spark for something much bigger. In that moment, Darius sensed this wasn't just a mistake. Her cold tone, the dismissive shrug, the way she handed him a dry sandwich and a cup of tap water while the other passengers dined on caviar. It all added up. This wasn't about the food. This was about being underestimated, disrespected, and dismissed yet again. He was the only black man in the cabin, and he felt the weight of that truth. Darius Coleman wasn't the kind of man to let that go unanswered. What came next would shake Stratus Air and send a message that no one would forget. Darius, a man used to commanding boardrooms and navigating billion-dollar deals, had no reason to expect that Flight 917 would be anything but a calm leg of his journey to Geneva. Clad in a sharp navy suit and polished loafers, he moved with quiet authority through the first-class cabin. The scent of fresh linen and champagne hung in the air, a curated illusion of refinement Stratus Air was known for. Settling into his seat, he opened his tablet and began reviewing the final details of a major European merger. His mind was already working through the next strategic move, but something in the environment kept pulling at his focus. The soft murmur of conversation, the hum of engines, everything was in place. Then the flight attendant approached with the menu. He barely looked up. His meal was already ordered, as always. Lobster bisque, filet mignon, simple expectations for someone in his position. But she disappeared quickly, and something about her haste unsettled him. When she returned, her smile was tight. "I'm sorry, sir, we're out of the luxury meal options. You'll have to choose from the regular selection." Her tone was smooth, but something about it was wrong. "I pre-ordered," Darius replied, confused. She shrugged. "It must not have gone through. Happens sometimes." Then she turned and walked away. No apology. No effort to fix it. He stared at the tray in front of him, a wilted sandwich and lukewarm water. Around him, white men in tailored suits were served with ceremony and care. It wasn't just about being skipped. It was how casually it had been done. The body language, the indifference, the lack of basic courtesy. This wasn't an accident. This was a message, whether she intended it or not. He didn't belong. Not really. Not in her eyes. He scanned the cabin. 6 men, all white, all relaxed. They hadn't noticed the slight. Of course they hadn't. To them, this flight was routine. For Darius, it was something else. A quiet reminder of how easily even powerful black men could be made invisible. But Darius had lived this before. The subtle racism, the quiet assumptions. He wasn't shocked. He was prepared. And he didn't respond with anger. He responded with strategy. While others sipped champagne, he began planning. 10 minutes passed. He tapped his fingers against the armrest, his mind already forming the next move. This wasn't about service anymore. This was about perception, about power. His phone buzzed. Marcus Brandt, his assistant. "Everything okay?" the message read. Darius typed back a single sentence. "Initiate internal audit protocol. Flight 917. Cabin crew ID needed. Confirm when ready." It wasn't about the food. It was about the culture that allowed this kind of thing to happen. And now he was going to expose it. As the flight continued, he stayed composed. The attendants floated by, chatting, pouring wine, unaware of what had begun. They didn't notice. The man they dismissed was now orchestrating something much bigger. Meanwhile, Marcus was already deep into the airline's employee records. He knew when Darius sent a command, it wasn't idle. It meant something. Within minutes, he had what he needed. A personnel file revealing the flight attendant in question had a history. Previous complaints, discriminatory remarks, subtle jabs about who deserved first-class service. This wasn't new, it was systemic. Darius wasn't interested in revenge. He was interested in exposure, in accountability, in making sure this kind of exclusion wasn't just called out, but dismantled. And by the time they landed in Geneva, the quiet act of disrespect would have triggered something far louder, a reckoning. The system needed to change, and Darius was determined to make sure no one would ever be treated that way again. He tapped the service button once more, this time with intent. When the older flight attendant approached, there was a pause in his step. He seemed to sense that something had shifted. Darius was no longer the quiet passenger who had politely ordered his meal earlier. His voice, though calm, carried a new weight as he asked again for clarification on the meal issue, his gaze locked on the attendant. "I pre-ordered a luxury meal," Darius said, his tone sharp and deliberate. "And yet I've been given something else. You mentioned something about prioritizing guests. Can you explain that?" The flight attendant hesitated, caught off guard, unable to form a response before Darius continued. "I understand," he said, each word slow and measured. "I understand, completely." As the flight descended into Geneva, Darius was already thinking ahead. His next step would be quiet, but definitive, and it would not go unnoticed. As the plane touched down, he knew Stratus Air was about to feel the ripple effects of his decision. This was no longer about him, or even the attendants. It was about holding an airline that boasted luxury to a much higher standard of respect. Two sharply dressed airline officials stood waiting for him once the plane landed. Darius didn't acknowledge them. He had already sent the video evidence to Stratus's CEO, and a formal request for a full audit was in progress. What no one on that flight realized was that Darius had carefully orchestrated a trap, one that would expose the quiet, persistent discrimination and favoritism that had been allowed to exist for far too long. When the cabin crew disembarked, they weren't greeted by the usual routine. Instead, a team of HR officers met them. The unchecked behavior, the subtle slights, and dismissive attitudes, they were all coming to an end. Darius Coleman had just become a name they would never forget. Watching them approach the exit, unaware of what awaited, Darius felt no need to speak or create a scene. The consequences would speak for themselves. Their actions, no matter how small they seemed, now carried weight. The transformation had begun before the plane had even landed. As they stepped off the aircraft, security and HR were already in place. Careers began to unravel in real time. Those small decisions, to ignore, to minimize, to dismiss, had finally caught up to them. They never realized who they were dealing with when they overlooked the man in seat 1A. There was no public fallout, no shouting match, just quiet accountability. They were escorted away, their records locked, and their futures uncertain. It wasn't merely termination, it was a reckoning. One act of disrespect had exposed a system that had tolerated too much for too long. Darius's message was unmistakable. No one, regardless of their position, should ever be treated as less. By the time Stratus's leadership grasped the full high picture, it was already too late. The shift had started, not with outrage, but with precision. A silent, strategic push that left the company with no choice but to confront the flaws it had ignored. Darius hadn't just held a few crew members accountable. He had challenged an entire culture. And in doing so, he proved that dignity, respect, and equality are not optional. They are non-negotiable. The crew didn't just lose their jobs, they lost the illusion that their behavior was harmless.